Okay, so this is very short notice that I said I was going to give this talk, so I don't expect anybody to turn up. I'm just talking to myself. I'll get better at trolling. Yeah, is that the word? Giving trailing. That's the word. I get better at trailing these talks when I know that I'm giving more of them. What I wanted to talk about today is um, working software and the chapter of my book called Escape. The idea of this is the metaphor. The idea is that you need your software to escape from, certainly from the development team and possibly from the organization that is funding you to develop this software, and um, and that is difficult for all sorts of reasons, and sometimes surprisingly difficult, but it's still very, very important. And there's one major payoff that you can get from actually managing to get the software to escape that I'll talk about right at the end. It's only going to be a 15-minute talk, and I'm using an outline that I've just written. So if you see me looking down and sideways, that's what I'm doing. I'm looking at that outline. So what is the ultimate goal of any software development project? The ultimate goal of any software development project is for the software to connect with its users so that it gets used, and then to generate value for those users and for the organization that funded this software development. So that's the final place that you're trying to get to. And the kind of received wisdom of Agile is that you try and get there as soon as possible. And there are lots of good reasons that I kind of set up in the book about why you should be trying to get to that point as soon as possible. So, like, with a small part of it. So I'm digressing a little bit here, but when I talk about in the first chapter, when I talk about the different value streams and how important it is to kind of get over this gap between the value streams, one of the ways to do that is to assemble a little bit of the real product value stream and get that working as soon as possible. And that's what you're doing when you're delivering working software. Now, there are lots and lots of different things when you start as a project manager to try and actually achieve this idea of getting working software and putting it in the hands of users. There are all sorts of problems that you're going to encounter. I've got a list here, but it's not an exhaustive list. Something that I've experienced on projects just recently is just the data that you're dealing with in this project is so sensitive that you can't really have prototypes. This is kind of like a really big problem. The data on one of the projects that I worked on, and this is obviously the case with a lot of things like financial applications, etc., you couldn't let the people who were using it know which other people were also using it. That was a secret. That's kind of one thing that might be a problem, and there are various strategies that you can come up with to get around that. Another one that might be kind of a problem is that the existence of this project is secret. So that maybe this is like a competitive advantage with against some other kind of organization. So you want to keep the fact that this is happening at all secret, so you can't really access the users that you want to use it until the very end of the project. A more common one, or in fact, like common, even if all of those other problems aren't a problem, is that there are various regulatory authorities that need to be pacified, need to be persuaded, you need to get their approval. There are all sorts of rules and regulations that you need to meet before something can actually go live. And we'll talk about that and how that interrelates with trying to get something actually available for escape in a minute. Another one which is kind of really in my the word that just drifted through my mind there was dumb, but it's kind of frustrating, questionable, and kind of the logic of it is like really like surprising, is the idea that kind of you are prevented from putting something on a live server somewhere where you can get it to real users, because the way that the budgeting works is that there is no budget for a live server until the kind of final expected deadline when the thing will be delivered. So this is often just kind of a different kind of practicality, a different kind of way of thinking about kind of how software works, that kind of you won't be needing that live server until you're finally fully live. So that's kind of an issue. And then the final reason here, but as I said, there are lots and lots of different reasons that could kind of happen. I've written in inverted commas in speech marks, legal requirements and reputational damage. And why have I written these in speech marks? The reason I've written these in speech marks is because often I only really hear these. In my mind, I'm hearing them. They're kind of people who they haven't really got a good reason why you shouldn't go live with a piece of software, but they're still kind of nervous that bad things will happen if you go live with this software, and so they kind of start talking about legal requirements. My experience is the people who are talking about real legal requirements don't really know much about the law and haven't talked to any lawyers. And when people talk about reputational damage, they're just kind of worried about. They're basically worried that this thing will be embarrassing in some way to the organization. Now, all of those things I think we're going to revisit when I talk about why it's a good idea, in spite of all those things, all those reasons. And there are always going to be a lot of reasons why people don't want to release software. It's still a good idea to release software. But why? What is the real reason that it's so difficult to release software? So those are kind of like, sound like good reasons. Some of them sound to me like excuses. What is the real reason that you meet an enormous amount of resistance when you try and release software? The real reason, I think, is because releasing the software is in direct conflict with the idea of the software. So actually starting to release the product is in direct conflict with the idea of the product. Why would this be? Well, the idea generates value. The idea very often offers a promise of things being easier, cheaper, more fun, more exciting, more smooth, more less involved, all sorts of good stuff. The idea promises lots of good stuff. And the first steps towards the reality that you launch are always going to be underwhelming. They're not going to deliver all of that promise that was in the idea. They're going to possibly deliver a tiny amount of that. And that is going to be in tension. The people who funded this thing, the people who got funding for this thing, the people who managed to generate enthusiasm for it, there's going to be some kind of potential embarrassment, some kind of potential conflict when we actually start to see the small thing that is delivering just some of that value. But you need to do it. This is the really, really important thing that you need to understand here. You need to do it anyway. You need to kind of, even though people come up with a lot of good reasons why you shouldn't release software, and there is this kind of tension with the original idea, you need to do it anyway. And why do you need to do it anyway? Well, the main reason is because starting to actually deliver real software to real users in real environments just provides you with a ton of information. So one of the reasons that starting to deliver software to real people in real environments provides you with a ton of information is that it suddenly, as if from nowhere, a whole load of regulators appear. A whole load of rules and regulations that you didn't know about start to kind of come into your view, and people start to ring up, people start to send you emails. Once you start to do something, people will appear and tell you to stop doing it. And that is, you are going to encounter these people at some point during this project. And when is it better to encounter them? Very often, I would argue, it's better to start finding out what their concerns are and start to address those concerns so that you can be allowed to finally release this software earlier rather than later. And so that's kind of regulatory stuff that you're going to find out if you start to try and push software nearer to live. The other thing is, I was talking about this idea of only paying for the live server like in the kind of final stages when kind of you're near a deadline and the thing is kind of anticipated to go live fully. Maybe you might think in this kind of day and age with cloud servers, etc., that it's going to be a relatively simple business to set up this thing in live. Maybe it's not. Maybe there are going to be all sorts of reasons why putting this thing in a live environment are going to be problematic. A live environment with the live data securely, all of those things. It's much better if you start to try to do that and find out what the issues are with putting this live in a live environment sooner rather than later, because you will be surprised by things in that kind of environment. The other thing that I've written here is the nearer the real environment, nearer real data you get, the more you learn. So, for example, a project that I worked on recently had some very, very secure data. It had to be kept secure. It's very sensitive. And one of the things that we did before we went live is we showed users the data that would be on the live system. It wasn't a live system. It was just a dummy system. They couldn't write to that data. They couldn't change it. All they could do was see it. But there were all sorts of weird things in the data from the previous system that looked peculiar in the new system that required a bunch of data cleaning. And we were able to do that before we actually went live with the system, because we'd shown them what this data would look like in the new system, even though it was only dummy data. So most data is dirtier than you think it's going to be. I don't know if that's a maxim anybody else has kind of come up with, but it's definitely something in my experience. So kind of like trying, the nearer you can get to real data in a real environment, the more, I'm waving my hands and you doing scare quotes a lot here, but the more that you will learn about what's going to happen in a real environment. And the final thing here is the final good reason. Actually, it's not the final good reason, because there's one overarching reason that I'm going to talk about right at the end. The way users respond to working software is just completely different to the way that they respond to a list of features. Absolutely, it's different to that. But it's also different to the way that they respond to kind of clickable interfaces that they might have used in user research. It's different from that as well. Maybe not so different, but it is different. When they're looking at their own data in a system where they can actually click at things and change things and react to things, that will be the nearest and the most useful thing that you will find. And this kind of brings us on to the main reason that you should be pushing for working software. And the reason that you should be pushing for working software and getting it, if you can, to the real users who are going to use this finally, in using real data, even if it's only a small part of what the final thing will be, is a thing called pull. If you can connect to users and start to generate value for those users, you completely change the underpinning of the project. The project up to that point was fueled by the excitement and enthusiasm for the idea. Once you can connect to users, this project is now fueled by the genuine need and the value that the users get out of your system, and then the value that this is real value, not enthusiasm and kind of like excitement about the idea. This is real value from users. So if you can provide that shift, if you can connect to the actual value from users, if you can connect to that pull, the dynamic of the project completely changes. And I'm only going to talk for 50 minutes. I promise I'm going to talk for 50 minutes. So just in the last 30 seconds, I'm going to say this, that very often, as a project manager, you're kind of on your own on this, that you're not going to get support from the people who initially had the idea, because they're very sensitive to the idea being knocked by kind of reputational damage of small parts of it being released early. You're not going to get a lot of support even from your team of developers, because they might be embarrassed by these small parts of the software that are starting to be released. You might not even initially, until you put things in their hands, get support from users. But even so, it's important as a project manager to keep pushing for this, to keep pushing for the software to escape, to get nearer and nearer the outside world. Because once you're in that situation where you've got pull, your project it's not necessarily on rails, but it's on a much firmer footing than it was when it was just powered by the enthusiasm for the idea. 16 minutes and I'll stop there.